Welcome. Today we are exploring one of the most visible and ultimately controversial families in modern American reality television.
We are, of course, talking about the Duggar family, the stars of the TLC series 19 Kids and Counting.
And it had a really significant run, didn't it? It started back in 2008 and was on the air until 2015, even after a couple of title changes as the family grew.
Right, it was 17 Kids and Counting, then 18 Kids, and so on.
But for you, our listener, we want to be very clear about our focus today. We're going to be setting aside the sort of day-to-day episode plots, the wedding planning, the family trips.
Exactly. We're not doing a recap. Our goal here is to really conduct a thorough examination of the cultural architecture that was built around this family.
You want to understand the history behind their specific beliefs, the political side of their platform, and the very complex and now very fractured legacy they've left behind.
That distinction is just so crucial. This isn't about the drama, it's about the sociology.
And the initial hook for millions was just the sheer scale of the family itself. You have the parents, Michelle and Jim Bob Duggar.
And their 19 children. 9 daughters, 10 sons. And of course, all their names famously start with the letter J.
It wasn't just a big family, it felt like an industrial-scale family operation, and one that was, perfectly designed for television.
And that scale translated directly into media dominance. This show was not some niche program.
No, not at all. Our sources confirm it was incredibly popular, especially for cable television at that time.
In its final seasons, I think it was season 10, the show was averaging about 2.3 million viewers for every new episode.
That's a huge number.
It is. That kind of consistent viewership put them regularly on the Nielsen Cable Top 25 list.
And when any show reaches that level of exposure, the message it's sending gets magnified into a kind of national conversation.
And the message here was very consistent. The show constantly hammered home the family's identity as devout independent Baptists.
Everything you saw, the rules, the way they spoke, their goals, it was all framed through values like purity, modesty, and, of course, their faith.
That public presentation is what we really need to deconstruct. So where do we start? What was the absolute foundation?
Well, to really get the Duggars' public life, you have to go back to their origins. You have to understand that the lifestyle we saw on TV was the result of some very profound decisions made early in their lives.
Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar married very young. This was back in July of 1984. She was only 17 and he was 19.
And neither of them went to college in the traditional sense. Instead, they focused right away on their own entrepreneurial ventures.
Right. Their early careers get a bit overshadowed by the TV fame, but it's essential for understanding their whole ethos of self-reliance.
They started with a used car business, then they moved into towing.
And eventually they made a really successful shift into real estate. Both Jim Bob and Michelle are licensed real estate agents.
And a huge portion of their income, even before the show took off, came from managing and renting out commercial properties that they owned around Springdale, Arkansas.
Yeah, that focus on real estate and owning assets was directly tied to their religious philosophy. Specifically, their goal of living completely debt-free.
So their entire financial structure was, fundamentally conservative and designed to be self-sustaining to insulate them.
Exactly. But all of that, the business history, it really pales in comparison to the spiritual decision that truly defined the family's story.
And that's the choice about family size. They didn't actually start out with 19 children in mind.
No, not at all. Initially, after their first son, Joshua, who was born in 1988, they used oral contraceptives. They were on birth control.
The turning point was a really tragic one.
It was. While she was on birth control, Michelle got pregnant again. But she had a miscarriage. They named the child, they lost Caleb.
And that experience really made them question their use of contraceptives from a deeply religious and spiritual perspective.
They talked to a doctor who explained that some types of birth control might allow for conception but could then prevent implantation, which would result in a very early miscarriage.
For them, this became a huge spiritual crisis.
And their resolution was radical. They decided to stop using any form of contraception, and they made this commitment to, in their words, allow God to determine the number of children they would have.
And this choice, it wasn't just a personal preference, right?
No, it was a profound theological commitment. It's rooted in specific fundamentalist Baptist beliefs that see children as direct blessings from God. So to them, using contraception was like rejecting a gift from God.
Over the next 2 decades, this commitment resulted in 17 more children.
It's an average of a birth every 15 months for over 21 years. That kind of dedication to a single theological principle is really what drew the media's attention to them in the first place.
And that commitment had to manifest itself physically. I mean, in their home, in their surroundings in Town, Arkansas.
Oh, absolutely. The house itself is like a monument to their life. It's a massive 7,000 square foot building. Construction started in 2000.
And it took 6 years to finish, right? They moved in around 2006.
It did. And this is where the media becomes a part of their actual physical structure. The completion of that home was documented in a TV special. It was called 16 Children and Moving In.
And we know that Discovery Networks and some corporate sponsors actually helped with the construction.
They did. They provided local construction workers, they donated appliances, furniture, and they even fully stocked that enormous pantry. So their life was literally, in part, built by the network that would go on to profit from it.
And to manage a home of that scale, you need a highly regimented life, which of course became the content of the show.
The whole system was built on a strict adherence to rules, especially rules about modesty and purity.
The dress code was central to their entire public identity. For the girls, there were no shorts, no pants, no tank tops.
Skirts and dresses only, and they had to be below the knee. And the purpose of that goes way beyond just being conservative. It's rooted in this specific idea of how to avoid the sin of defrauding other people.
Let's unpack that concept, defrauding, because it is absolutely key to understanding the burden that was placed on the daughters.
Well, Michelle Duggar was quoted explaining it. She said that bearing your thigh was considered nakedness and shame. But the spiritual goal was to avoid tempting men.
So modesty was framed as not stirring up desires in someone else that cannot be righteously fulfilled.
And what's so fascinating and frankly controversial about this belief is how it shifts responsibility.
Right.
The sources show that the burden of maintaining purity is placed squarely on the woman. She has to dress modestly so she doesn't cause a man to be tempted.
So if a man has an impure thought, the woman's clothing is seen as a potential cause.
It's often seen as the primary catalyst. That is the core mechanism of purity culture. And it became this defining, marketable feature of their TV show.
And because the goal was to avoid temptation, they also had to restrict their environment.
Yes, they actively avoided places like beaches or public swimming pools.
And the reason they gave was that it was, quote, too hard for the guys to try to keep their eyes averted in those places.
That one rule just highlights the total commitment to controlling every visual stimulus to maintain this idea of purity.
And the control wasn't just physical, it was intellectual.
All 19 kids were homeschooled. Their access to media, to information, was severely restricted. It was filtered down to only wholesome family television, historical events, and a heavily filtered internet.
They were intentionally shielded from secular education, from modern pop culture. That isolation was a feature of their system. It wasn't a bug.
And finally, you have the rules for romance, the famous chaperoned courtship system.
This was not dating in any mainstream sense of the word. They called it dating with a purpose.
The only purpose being marriage.
Yeah.
And acquaintance was only allowed in group settings, always with a chaperone.
And crucially, the whole process required explicit parental permission.
The young man who was interested had to go speak to the father, to Jim Bob, first. This system just reinforced that rigid male hierarchy. The father was the absolute gatekeeper for his daughter's futures.
And the show used this unique, highly controlled process to generate its main storylines. You know, watching these young people try to find love while following rules that ban almost any private interaction.
When you put all of that together, the massive family, the homeschooling, the financial model, the rigid moral code, the Duggars just couldn't help but stand out.
There was a writer for the Dallas Morning News, Arnold Hamilton, who described the family as part Little House on the Prairie, part yours, mine, and ours.
And that contrast was really jarring for the average American viewer. Statistically, they were complete outliers.
Yeah, the census data from 2002 showed that only 0.3% of American women had 7 or more children.
So the Duggars were multiplying at a rate that was completely contrary to all the demographic trends in the country.
That anomaly status is what made people curious, but it also inevitably drew really intense scrutiny about the ideologies they seemed to represent.
The big ideological debate that followed them their whole career was their connection to the Quiverful movement.
And that movement specifically encourages couples to refuse all forms of birth control.
Right, based on the belief that they should allow God to determine the number of children they would have. Sounds familiar.
It does, but the Duggars consistently denied any formal link to the Quiverful movement. They always maintained they were simply Bible-believing Christians.
They tried very hard to separate their public image from that specific political label.
But that denial was often contradicted by their own materials, wasn't it?
It was. The name quiverful itself comes from a specific Bible verse, Psalm 127, which compares children to arrows in a warrior's quiver.
And the Duggars had an article on their own website that specifically referenced that exact psalm to explain why they had such a large family.
Not only that, but records show they were interviewed for a Quiverful affiliated website way back in 2001, long before the reality show was a huge hit.
But the more significant connection, the one that really provides the analytical context, is their association with the teachings of a man named Bill Gockard.
And his organizations, the Institute in Basic Life Principles, or IBLP, and the Advanced Training Institute, ATI.
We should probably spend a minute on IBLP because it seems to be the ideological engine running that household, and it's the source of so much of the later criticism.
Well, IBLP is built on a concept called umbrella authority, or chain of command.
Umbrella authority.
Yes. The teaching is that God has ordained specific authorities, these umbrellas, that people should stay under to receive God's protection. For a daughter, her authority is her father.
Until she gets married.
Exactly. At which point that authority transfers to her husband. And submission to that authority is paramount. To question it is to step out from under the umbrella, leaving yourself spiritually vulnerable.
So the system wasn't just about having a lot of kids. It was about ensuring this rigid hierarchy where the male parent is the ultimate authority, controlling everything.
Everything, the external environment and the internal lives of his family. And that structure directly informed the criticism from people like Christy Mazares-Winkles.
She argued that the Duggars were essentially unofficial spokespeople for the whole quiverful philosophy.
Her point was that by showing this seemingly happy, successful, large family on national TV, the show was giving a huge platform to an ideology that, to most people, would seem extreme.
And she noted that the show deliberately downplayed the more controversial parts, like the rigid male hierarchy and the patriarchal gender roles.
Exactly. It packaged the lifestyle as just unique and functional, and it masked the underlying ideology that critics saw as incredibly limiting, especially for the daughters.
The show made it seem normal that the older girls were basically being trained as co-parents and domestic servants.
Right, instead of encouraging them to pursue education or careers outside the home. That ideology inevitably pushed the Duggars into politics, which brought on a whole different level of public criticism.
And Jim Bob Duggar had already been a Republican in the Arkansas House of Representatives, so they were already politically active.
Right. And this blend of their fundamentalist beliefs with active political lobbying is what led to some of the harshest commentary.
Nina Burley, writing for the New York Observer, had that famous line describing their appeal as good TV. Good sugar-coated rat poison, politically speaking.
That quote just captured the public tension perfectly.
Yeah.
She wasn't just criticizing their show, she was linking their wholesome appeal to their lobbying efforts against abortion and, crucially, against legislation protecting transgender rights.
The wholesomeness was seen as a kind of Trojan horse for a very specific political agenda.
And that political backlash really peaked in 2014 with the robocall scandal in Fayetteville, Arkansas.
Right. Michelle Duggar recorded a political robocall against a non-discrimination ordinance that the city council had passed.
And the language she used was extremely provocative. It was immediately labeled by critics as transphobic. She warned that the ordinance would allow men, yes, I said men, to use women's and girls' restrooms, locker rooms, showers.
The most inflammatory part was when she claimed it would allow males with past child predator convictions that claim they are female to have a legal right to enter private areas that are reserved for women and girls.
That statement just drove the controversy into the heart of the culture war over gender identity and public safety.
The public reaction was massive.
It was. The outrage led to two huge duelingchange.org petitions, one demanding the show be canceled and the other demanding TLC keep it on the air.
And the fact that both petitions got over 100,000 signatures just shows how much the Duggars had become a cultural fault line in America.
And their stance on LGBT issues was often amplified by their oldest son, Josh Duggar.
At the time, he was the executive director for the political arm of the Family Research Council, FRC Action,
an organization that the Southern Poverty Law Center designated as an anti-gay hate group.
Josh himself was described by Gleolad as an anti-gay activist. So the show wasn't just entertainment. It was tied to a political movement actively lobbying against civil rights.
And beyond the politics, there were also these really serious structural criticisms about child welfare.
Back in 2010, the Los Angeles Times looked into whether the show was following child labor laws.
The issue was that the producers hadn't gotten work permits for the minors under 16 on the show. Jim Bob Duggar's defense was that filming wasn't work.
But critics argue that even if filming wasn't legally work, the actual responsibilities placed on the older daughters definitely was.
Yes, Catherine Joyce, who wrote a lot about the Christian patriarchy movement, made that point very sharply.
She said the show was misleading. It presented the household as quirky and fun, but in reality, the older girls were forced to serve as co-parents to the detriment of things like their education.
They were essentially unpaid domestic staff for their younger siblings, and this goes right back to that IBLP hierarchy.
If the daughters are always under their father's umbrella, their purpose is defined by domesticity and submission.
Which leaves them with a limited education, few professional skills, and really very few options in adulthood, besides marriage, motherhood, and conveniently continuing their lives on reality TV.
So the critique is that the show wasn't just documenting a lifestyle, it was actively profiting from a system designed to limit the choices of its female stars.
But all of those controversies, the politics, the patriarchy, they were completely overshadowed by the catastrophic events of May 2015.
This was the moment that the public image, the one that had been so carefully built for years, just completely collapsed.
The crisis started when a 2006 police report was leaked. The magazine In Touch Weekly published the details.
And this report centered on sexual molestation allegations against the family's oldest son, Josh Duggar. This is a profoundly serious and sensitive issue, and we want to handle these details with compassion and respect for the victims.
The report detailed that between 2002 and 2003, when Josh was 14 and 15, he fondled 5 girls. 4 of them were his younger sisters.
The acts involved inappropriate touching, sometimes while the girls were asleep, and it is so critical to remember the timeline here. This all happened years before the Duggars became television stars.
The police report noted that authorities were contacted at the time, but the case was never fully investigated. And by 2015, the statute of limitations had expired.
But the revelation itself immediately contradicted the entire purity brand the family had been selling for 7 years.
The corporate fallout was immediate. It was a powerful lesson in just how non-negotiable family values are when they're confronted with child abuse allegations.
On May 22, 2015, TLC suspended the series. They pulled all the reruns off the air right away.
Their statement said they were deeply saddened and troubled by this heartbreaking situation.
And the reaction from corporate sponsors just showed how much risk was tied up in the Duggars' moral brand. Over 20 major national advertisers just rushed to pull their ads.
We're talking huge companies: General Mills, Walgreens, Pizza Hut, Crayola, Payless, Choice Hotels. It was a corporate exodus.
That kind of swift abandonment just proves that the entire financial engine of the Duggar brand depended on a perfect image of purity.
The second that image shattered, the financial support just vanished. And then Hulu, the big streaming platform, removed the show's entire back catalog. The series was essentially erased from public view overnight.
The family did try to manage the narrative. They went on a public defense.
Josh Duggar released a statement. He apologized for having acted inexcusably, and he resigned from his job at the Family Research Council.
His wife, Anna, also made a statement. She confirmed she knew about what Josh had done 2 years before they got married.
And she defended her decision to marry him, saying she believed the counseling he received had changed his life.
Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar also went on the offensive. They tried to frame the past allegations as a dark period that caused them to seek God like never before.
They did an exclusive interview with Megyn Kelly on Fox News, trying to control the message and reassure their conservative base.
But the damage was just irreversible. Discovery Communications, which is TLC's parent company, officially canceled 19 Kids and Counting on July 16, 2015.
Production stopped. It was the end of a 7-year run.
The network tried to salvage something from the situation. TLC announced they would produce a 1-hour, commercial-free documentary special on child abuse.
And it would feature Jill and Jessa Duggar, 2 of the adult daughters who are also victims. It was an attempt to shift the focus to the victims and show some social responsibility.
But the financial collapse for the Duggars was enormous. The show paid them an estimated $25,000 to $45,000 per episode.
But one branding expert estimated the total loss from endorsements, speaking gigs, book deals, could cost the family as much as $25 million a year.
That number just speaks volumes about the market value of that wholesome Christian family image and how quickly a brand built on moral authority can just disintegrate. But even with that definitive cancellation, the Duggars television story wasn't immediately over.
No, TLC knew they still had a massive audience built up, so they very quickly executed a spin-off strategy.
The successor show, Jill and Jessa, Counting On, launched in December 2015. That was only a few months after the cancellation.
And the concept was a really surgical pivot. It focused on the newly married adult children, Jill and Derek, Jessa and Ben, and the other adult kids.
While pointedly excluding Josh Duggar from the entire story.
And the strategy worked. The audience was still deeply invested in the daughters. The premiere of Counting On got over 2.2 million viewers.
That's almost the same ratings as the original show's final season.
So the network quickly picked it up for a full season in 2016. It continued for several years, really effectively sustaining the Duggar media machine.
But the legal and moral issues around Josh Duggar were a constant shadow over the brand.
And the continuation proved to be temporary. 6 years after the first scandal, Counting On was finally canceled in 2021.
This was right after Josh Duggar's arrest in April of that year for possession of child pornography.
And his subsequent conviction. The network just couldn't justify the show's existence anymore after a second, definitive legal crisis.
What's most significant about this period after the final cancellation is the fracturing of the family's narrative.
Yes. Once the children who grew up inside that rigid IBLP system and inside the reality TV bubble, once they started to get their own independent public voices, the whole carefully curated image began to crack.
And this shift has given us some of the most profound insight into those structural critiques we were talking about earlier.
The most direct and high-profile criticism came from Ginger Duggar, the sixth child.
In 2023, she released a book, Becoming Free Indeed, which was essentially a public break from the core beliefs of her upbringing.
Her statements directly challenged the whole idea that the Duggar life was one of simple, joyful conformity. Ginger openly criticized what she called the cult-like religious beliefs they were raised with.
Her book details the psychological toll of living inside that IBLP framework.
She stated very clearly, fear was a huge part of my childhood. And she connected that fear directly to the endless rules, the belief that God's favor depended on their perfect behavior.
She said she believed she had to wear only skirts and dresses to please God, and that things like music with drums or the wrong friendships could all bring harm.
That is such a powerful articulation of that IBLP umbrella authority idea in practice. The system was designed to instill fear that stepping outside the rules would lead to divine punishment.
For her to say that publicly is a direct condemnation of the very structure that the show is built on.
She really pulled no punches in her final assessment of the teaching. She said, quote, "The teaching I grew up under was harmful. It was damaging, and there are lasting effects."
That testimony just forces the public to completely reevaluate the show's legacy.
It does. When the show was on, the rules seemed maybe quaint or just strict. But now, from an insider, we hear them described as mechanisms of control that caused long-term psychological damage.
The reality TV camera had framed structural limitations as just wholesome uniqueness.
So when you look back over the full story of 19 Kids and Counting and its spin-off, you see so much more than just a canceled TV show.
It was like a national, decade-long laboratory for watching fundamentalism in the spotlight.
The whole phenomenon became this exhaustive cultural study of how these rigid, deeply held religious beliefs were monetized, scrutinized, and then ultimately exposed by reality media.
The Duggar story really highlights the tension between, belief and commerce.
A private, separatist ideology that was aimed at achieving moral and financial independence.
Was exploited to create a multi-million-dollar brand built on public purity.
And once the truth about the internal control and the devastating crises came out, the commercial value of that curated image just evaporated instantly.
It's a really compelling case study on media framing. For years, the public was sold a version of life where subservience was presented as happiness and limitations were presented as protection.
And where the family hierarchy was divinely ordained. But the testimony from the adult children suggests that what the media sold as wholesome was actually experienced as harmful and fear-based.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought that goes far beyond just this one family.
In an age of constant documentation, when private lives become public brands, how much does the frame of the reality TV camera dictate how we perceive these deep-seated cultural and religious movements?
And what ethical obligation does a network or even the viewer have when a highly curated public image is used to mask or even monetize these restrictive and damaging internal structures?
It's a sobering reflection on the cost of visibility.
Thanks for listening.